Hey viewers! Hope you're all doing great. Before I start the story, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy my videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. At the first faint blush of dawn, a pale golden light drifts across the castle walls as though a whisper. In the great bakehouse, tucked into a cool corner of the courtyard, the castle baker stands at his wooden table, his hands gentle but sure. He presses into a mound of dough, folding and stretching, folding again, as though shaping not just flour and water, but an offering. The castle is quiet except for the dull crackle of the hearth, where a bed of embers glows softly, and the far-off chiming of church bells floats across the valley, humming in harmony with the day's slow awakening. He works with rye and wheat, but his mind is firmly on the pure white loaf that will one day serve at the Lord's table. This bread is not like the coarse, heavy loaves eaten by the cooks, servants, and guards. This is bread for holy purpose. The host, the sacramental bread used for the Eucharist. It must be made from wheat, pure, simple, humble wheat, according to theological teachings that have taken shape in the centuries of Christendom. The baker's arms move, unhurried, his fingers pressing lightly, coaxing the dough into life, feeling how it yields, how it breathes. In medieval Europe, bread was the lifeblood of daily existence. For most people, peasants, soldiers, laborers, bread was common, dense, dark. Rye was especially widespread, for it could grow in poorer soils and harsher climates. Often, rye loaves were mixed with barley or other grains, or combined with wheat to produce a more economical bread called maslin or metal. The resulting loaves were hearty, heavy, offering sustenance for the long hours of work in field, stable, or forge. The poor or servants might even have to subsist on barley or oat breads, barley being especially associated with hardship. Monks who misbehaved were once punished by being made to eat barley bread for a time. But this bread in the bakehouse now, pressed on the baker's board, is destined not for daily toil. It is destined for ritual. According to Christian theology, especially as articulated by thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, the host must be made from pure wheat. He insisted that only wheat flour, with nothing else, could carry the holy presence. The bread also was to be unleavened, thin, flat, recalling the Passover tradition. The baker knows that even a stray grain of rye or barley, or any amount of leaven, would render the bread unacceptable for the sacrament. He sprinkles a little flour on the table, dust motes dancing faintly in the morning light, and lifts the dough to fold it over again, turning it gently. The smell is simple but rich, the faint sweetness of wheat, the faint yeasty tang. Though this dough will rise only a little, carefully controlled, because too much leaven would go against the strict practices set for sacramental bread in later centuries. In the Middle Ages, everyday bread was very different from this. In towns and villages, professional bakers oversaw the production of a variety of loaves, from coarse to fine, regulated by law. In the 13th century, for example, the assize of bread established rules about the weight and price of different qualities of bread, depending on which flour was used. Only the finest, most refined white bread, sometimes called manchet, was made for the wealthy, for lords, nobles, and clergy. The coarser loaves, darker, heavier, were for the common people. Outside, beyond the castle walls, villagers carried pale, dense loaves home in baskets. These loaves might weigh several pounds, baked in communal ovens owned by the lord of the manor or by the village itself. The baker in the castle works not just for the lord of the manor but also for the chapel. This loaf will be consecrated, will become more than bread. As he kneads, he thinks of the oak fire crackling in the hearth. The heat is steady but not fierce, the stones of the oven warmed through. In some places people even baked bread under ashes, ash cakes, though that practice is more common in other lands and in simpler bread traditions. But this is not such bread. This is carefully worked dough, destined for ritual. He allows the dough to rest now, covering it with a cloth, letting it sleep quietly. That pause is essential. Even in a sacred context, the dough must breathe. He listens to the bells echoing across the valley, their tolling gentle and sure, as though calling the faithful to prayer. In his mind, he sees monks in the chapel, silent, robed in austerity, moving slowly to prepare the altar. In monasteries, too, bread is baked under strict guidelines. Different grades are produced. The best quality for the abbot and his honored guests, coarser loaves for the work brothers or lower-ranking servants. The monastic bakehouse is a place of discipline and devotion, the oven fired in the early hours, the hands of the brethren pressing dough with care. Bakeries are regulated. Grains are sourced carefully. In some abbeys, wheat fields are prized for sacramental bread. Our castle baker has learned his craft over many years. He was apprenticed as a boy, learning to read the dough, to feel when it is ready, to know how long the fire must burn, how hot the hearthstones should be for the perfect bake. The process takes patience. Too hot, and the bread will burn. Too cool, and it will not bake through, leaving a doughy heart. He shapes the loaf into a small round disc, carefully forming its edges, smoothing its surface. It is plain, without ornate pattern, because for the Eucharist simplicity is virtue. No seeds, no herbs, no embellishments. The theology demands purity. He sprinkles a little more flour, smooths the disc, and then gently sets it aside to rest. Nearby, on a shelf, other loaves wait. Coarser brown loaves of rye and maslin destined for the kitchen, for soldiers, for the poor. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, servants are already preparing morning meals. The rich, inside the great hall, may soon break their trencher bread, thick slabs of stale or fresh loaves that double as plates. These trenchers soak up meat juices and sauces, and when dinner ends, the leftover bread is often given to the poor or to animals. The trenches are not just food, but utility, a testament to the resourcefulness of medieval life. But in the chapel, this small white disc, this humble loaf of wheat, carries weight far beyond usefulness. When the priest lifts it, blesses it, and breaks it, it becomes the body of Christ in the theological imagination of the faithful. The baker's breath, the warmth of the oven, the rhythm of his hands, they all contribute to this act of consecration, though he will never taste the mystery himself. In those early centuries of Christian liturgy, things were not always so strict. Before the year 1000 CE, Christians sometimes used whatever bread was at hand. Bread made from mixed grains, various doughs, shapes, ingredients. But as doctrine developed, as theologians like Aquinas gave clearer rules, the Church increasingly required that the host be made from pure wheat, unleavened, without additions. The baker is aware of these traditions, not just as rules, but as a sacred lineage. He lifts his head, listening. The bells now ring more insistently, calling to the first service of the day. Outside, the valley brightens, dew catching on grass, a soft breeze rustling leaves in the trees. He rises, carries the loaf carefully to a small side table, and lays it on a linen cloth, his hands reverent. The smell of warm wheat, of wood smoke, of long patience lingers in the air, soothing and real. In those medieval times, bread was more than food. It was law, it was economy, it was faith. The higher bread, the manchet, the white loaf, symbolized prestige and holiness. The darker rye loaves fed the masses. The difference in grain, in quality, in refinement, mirrored the social structure. Lords and clergy ate what the peasantry could seldom afford. But here, in this small chapel, the baker's modest disc of wheat will be elevated. It will be broken, shared, consecrated. It will become more than sustenance. It will become the symbol of sacrifice, of unity, of the divine. He closes his eyes for a moment, hearing only the crackle of the hearth, the distant bells, the soft hush of morning. He breathes in the scent of warm flour, the faint sweetness, and lets his thoughts drift. This bread, made carefully, humbly, with devotion, it carries centuries of faith. It carries the hands of all those who have baked before him, the tradition of monasteries, the theology of generations. And as the time draws near for the sacred service, he feels a quiet pride in his work. This is not just the labor of a baker. It is a ministry. He has given his skill, his care, his patience to this one small loaf. And though he may never speak of it, in the silence of the bakehouse, he knows. This bread is for the Lord's table. He takes a slow breath as he steps back from the table, letting the warmth of the hearth brush gently against his face. The dough rests under its cloth like a sleeping child, rising faintly with the deep patience of wheat turned into promise. Outside, the courtyard begins to stir in muted ways. The soft shuffle of boots, the clinking of a bucket carried by a servant heading toward the well, the rustle of straw as stable boys greet the horses with murmured voices. These sounds echo through stone corridors, softened by distance, muffled by the early hour, creating a rhythm that is almost like breathing. Steady, grounding, unhurried. Inside the bakehouse, time feels slower. The fire's glow flickers across the baker's hands as he cleans the wooden surface, brushing away stray bits of flour. He does not hurry, for bread cannot be rushed. Patience is its oldest companion. Medieval bakers knew that dough responded not just to ingredients, but to weather, to temperature, to the mood of the day itself. A warm morning sped the rise. A cold one stalled it. Humidity thickened the dough. Dryness made it brittle. The baker had learned to read these subtle signs not from books but from years of watching, listening, feeling. He steps to the large stone oven and opens its heavy door, letting a muted burst of warmth spill into the room. The smell of oak embers drifts gently into the air, a scent almost sweet, slightly smoky, comforting. Many medieval ovens used hardwoods like oak or beech, prized for the steady heat they produced, their embers burning hot and clean. The baker reaches for a long-handled rake and pulls the glowing coals toward the center, smoothing them evenly across the floor of the oven. The stones beneath are ancient, darkened by countless firings, holding within them the memory of every loaf ever baked here, every morning's labor, every feast day, every humble meal. He knows that before he places the sacred loaf inside, he will clear the coals, sweep the stones carefully, and test the heat with a simple gesture, holding his hand near the opening, judging warmth not by numbers or instruments but by instinct. Medieval bakers often used their own skin as the gauge, or a pinch of flour tossed onto the oven floor to see how quickly it browned. Such quiet bodily knowledge, passed from master to apprentice, made up the science of the bakehouse long before thermometers existed. The dough under the cloth has risen enough now. Not too much, not too little. Just the right breath of life to hold its shape without puffing into leavened bread. He lifts the linen gently, revealing the pale, smooth surface of the host loaf. Simplicity is striking. No elaboration, no marking, no touch of decoration. Later centuries would see stamped wafers, pressed thin and embossed with symbols. But in earlier medieval times, sacramental loaves could still be simple. Small, pure, unleavened discs blessed by the church. He touches the dough lightly with the back of his fingers. Cool, soft, patient. Nearly ready, he murmurs to no one. His voice barely a whisper. The bakehouse absorbs his words. Its stone walls used to such murmurs. Used to the quiet presence of a man who wakes before dawn to shape flour and water into nourishment. Outside, a faint breeze slips in through the small window slit, carrying with it the smells of the waking world. Damp earth, distant fields, a faint hint of smoke from hearths in village homes below the castle. In those cottages, bread is simpler still. Women rise early, mixing coarsely ground grain with water, sometimes with a little yeast saved from the previous batch, sometimes without. Their loaves are heavy, uneven, baked on flat stones or in communal ovens shared by the whole village. Children might be sent running with baskets of dough to the oven keeper, who tended the fire and returned the finished loaves hours later. Bread was not only food. It was the center of domestic life, the sign of a household functioning, a daily ritual repeated through generations. The baker steps to the shelf where several wooden peels lean neatly. He selects a smaller one, smooth and worn from years of use, and dusts its surface lightly with flour. Then he returns to the sacred loaf, lifting it carefully, almost reverently, and placing it onto the peel. Though he has done this thousands of times, there is always a solemnity in handling the bread destined for the chapel. He steadies his breath, allowing the moment its own quiet weight. In the silence, the bells ring again, this time the deeper, fuller tone that signals the approach of prime, the early morning prayer. The sound vibrates through stone, through wood, through the baker's ribs. He pauses to listen, eyes half closed, letting the resonance settle into him. The bells are the heartbeat of the castle and its chapel, marking the hours, calling monks and clergy to prayer, reminding everyone of the rhythm of the day, the cycle of work and devotion. He turns back to the oven. The embers glow a deep orange now, their heat steady and ready. With practiced motions, he sweeps the coals to the side, brushes ash from the middle, and tests the warmth. A faint shimmer quivers in the air above the stone floor, a sign of the heat rising gently, evenly like a soft exhale. This is the moment. He slides the peel forward, placing the loaf into the heart of the oven. The dough meets the hot stone with a muted sigh, a sound so soft that only someone listening closely would notice. He withdraws the peel slowly, leaving the loaf to bake in the intimate embrace of heat and time. Then he closes the oven door. The hush that follows feels sacred in itself. The baker stands before the oven for a moment, hands resting lightly at his sides, feeling the heat radiate outward. He knows this part of the process cannot be rushed or watched too closely. The loaf must bake alone, undisturbed, its pale surface firming slowly, its moisture rising in faint breaths of steam. He steps back, letting the oven do its work, trusting in the age-old partnership between fire and flour. A few steps away, a small table holds yesterday's loaves, brown, hearty, destined for the castle's meals. He picks one up, examining its crust. It is rougher than the host, flecked with bits of rye, the color of deep earth. This is the bread that most people know intimately. The bread of peasants, soldiers, servants, travelers. It is filling, sturdy, sometimes slightly sour, sometimes slightly sweet depending on the grain and the fermentation. In some years, famine forces people to stretch their flour with whatever can be found. Acorns, ground peas, even straw in desperate times. Bread mirrored the fragility of harvests, the vulnerability of the poor. But wheat, pure wheat, was precious. And the Eucharistic bread, made from that pure wheat, symbolized something beyond nourishment, symbolized hope. The baker thinks of this as he listens to the oven's quiet crackles. He remembers hearing priests speak of the miracle of the Mass, how the bread becomes the body, how something ordinary becomes divine. He does not claim to understand the mystery, but he respects it deeply. In his own way, he sees the transformation in every loaf he bakes. From raw grain grown in fields, to flour milled by hand or by water wheel, to dough shaped with care, to bread warm from the fire. It is its own kind of miracle, humble and earthly. Minutes pass. The baker hums under his breath, a slow, tuneless melody that keeps him company in the long silence. He wipes his hands on his apron, checks the cloth-covered bowls on the shelf, prepares the next batch of dough for the castle's kitchens. Work continues, even as the sacred loaf bakes. When he finally opens the oven, the heat rushes out in a gentle wave, caressing his face. Inside, the host loaf sits pale but firm, its surface dry and set, its shape unchanged. Unlike common bread, it does not rise high, does not blister or crack. It remains simple, unassuming, humble. He reaches in with the peel, lifts the loaf out, and places it on a clean linen cloth to cool. It will rest now until the chapel assistant comes to collect it, a boy often shy and soft-spoken, who steps quietly into the bakehouse as though entering holy ground. The baker looks at the loaf one last time, feeling that familiar sense of quiet completion. Another morning's sacred duty fulfilled. He watches the loaf cool, the pale surface settling into stillness, like quiet moonlight resting on linen. The warmth slowly leaves it, drifting into the air in soft little waves that fade with each passing minute. The baker closes his eyes for a moment, feeling the gentle shift of heat against his face, as though the bread itself sighs in contentment after its brief journey through fire. A faint knock at the bakehouse door interrupts the silence, gentle, almost timid. When it opens, a thin sliver of morning light slips across the stone floor, accompanied by the soft shuffle of boots. The chapel assistant enters, a young boy no more than 12, wrapped in a simple wool tunic, his hair slightly tousled as though he, too, has risen before the sun. He holds his hands clasped together, a habitual gesture of reverence he has not yet outgrown. The boy does not speak at first. He steps closer, eyes lowering respectfully toward the loaf. Even though he has seen the baker perform this task many times, each morning he behaves as though witnessing something sacred. It is not the bread alone that humbles him, but the weight of tradition it carries. The knowledge that within the walls of the chapel, this simple disk will become the center of prayer. The baker gives a small nod, inviting the boy forward. The assistant lifts the linen cloth gently, folding it around the loaf with practiced care. His fingers tremble ever so slightly. Whether from the chill of dawn or the solemnity of his task, it is hard to tell. When he cradles the loaf in his arms, it seems almost too small a burden to carry such spiritual significance. Before he leaves, the boy bows his head in quiet gratitude. The baker, in response, offers a soft smile, the kind that needs no words. Then the assistant slips back through the door, and the echo of his footsteps fades into the corridor. Left alone, the baker turns back to his work, but something about the morning air has shifted. Now that the sacred loaf has gone, the bakehouse feels more grounded, more earthly. The remaining tasks waiting on the wooden table speak to daily life, to the needs of the living. He retrieves a large bowl of dough prepared the night before, a darker mixture made partly of rye. Its smell is different from the wheat loaf, earthier, deeper, carrying the scent of the soil and the season. Rye was a staple grain in much of medieval Europe, thriving where wheat struggled. Its resilience made it the grain of the common people, especially in northern climates. This dough is destined for the castle soldiers and lower servants, those who rise early and work long hours, who need bread that fills the belly and sustains the body through labor. He dusts the table with flour and turns the heavy dough onto the surface. It falls with a muted thud, firm and substantial. Working it requires strength. He presses into it with steady rhythmic force, pushing the heel of his palm forward, folding the dough back, repeating the movement in soothing cycles. The dough resists at first. Rye often does, but slowly yields, becoming more pliable with each turn. Outside, the sounds of waking life grow stronger. Chickens cluck restlessly in their coop. A guard calls out a greeting to another atop the wall walk. A wagon creaks over stones as it brings produce from the nearby village. These noises form a kind of medieval symphony, not loud or chaotic, but layered and familiar, grounding the castle in its daily rituals. As he kneads, the baker hums again, that same wordless tune he often drifts into. It is steady and low, blending with the soft friction of dough against wood. His movements take on a meditative quality, repetitive, calming, guided by the sort of wisdom that doesn't require thought. Medieval bakers relied as much on intuition as on skill, sensing the dough's readiness through touch alone. When the dough reaches the right consistency, he cuts it into portions with a wooden scraper. The pieces are large, meant to produce loaves hearty enough to last through a day's labor. He shapes them with practiced motions. Tuck, turn, press, smooth. Each loaf is slightly different, for no two masses of dough behave exactly alike. But that variation is accepted, even cherished. Bread is a living thing, shaped by the hands that make it and the air it breathes. Across the castle grounds, in the great hall, workers are preparing for the morning meal. Trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread, are stacked neatly in baskets, ready to serve as plates. The trenchers will soak up meat drippings, broth or stew, and afterward may be handed out to the poor who gather outside the hall. No food is wasted, for in these times, hunger is a constant presence, lurking at the edges of every household. The baker lines up the shaped rye loaves on a wooden board dusted with flour. He covers them with cloth and leaves them to rise near the warmth of the hearth, though not too close. Rye dough prefers a slow rise. Too much heat and it becomes dense. Too little and it remains heavy. He steps back, taking a moment to stretch his hands, feeling the gentle ache in his fingers and wrists from years of labor. In the corner sits a small sack of barley flour. Barley bread, though eaten by many, especially in monasteries, is considered coarse and less desirable. It was often used when wheat was scarce or expensive. In some monasteries, barley loaves were even assigned as a mild punishment for misbehavior, or as an expression of humility. Yet barley has its own subtle sweetness, one that peasants recognized well. On another shelf is a smaller bag of oat flour, more common in certain regions. Oat bread rarely rises well, producing flatter, denser loaves. Still, it was comforting and filling, nourishment shaped by necessity rather than luxury. The baker prepares a small mixture of barley and oat flour for the afternoon batch. In medieval kitchens, mixing grains was common, creating maslin or métail loaves. These breads served large households efficiently, offering a balance of flavor and sustenance without the cost of pure wheat. As he blends the flours, he pauses, hearing a distant sound, chanting drifting from the chapel. The monks have begun their prayer, their voices soft and layered, echoing gently through stone corridors. Though he cannot hear words clearly, the cadence is unmistakable, long, slow syllables rising and falling like waves. Somewhere in that sacred space, the loaf he baked now rests on a silver paten, waiting for blessing. He breathes in deeply, letting the faint hum of chanting settle into his chest. There is something deeply soothing about it, even when heard from afar. It reminds him that his work, humble though it may be, connects him to a larger story, one woven through faith, tradition, and the quiet labors of countless hands before him. He returns to his mixing bowl, adding water and salt to the barley oat blend, stirring until the dough begins to form. It is softer than the rye mixture, stickier, requiring patient coaxing. He works it slowly, letting the texture guide him. In medieval bread making, each grain had its own temperament, its own way of responding to touch. Wheat was smooth and strong. Rye was dense and earthy. Barley was soft and fragile. Oats were temperamental, often crumbling without care. As he kneads, he imagines the monks handling their own dough in the monastery bakehouse. Many monasteries were self-sufficient, growing their own grains, grinding them in watermills, baking bread not only for themselves but for guests, travelers, and the poor. Bread was central to monastic hospitality, a symbol of welcome, of shared community. The baker's thoughts drift again to the chapel. The silence between chants is filled with meaning. He pictures the priest preparing the altar, laying linens carefully, placing candles just so, handling the vessels with careful reverence. Soon the sacred loaf will be lifted, broken, blessed. Soon the faithful will bow their heads. And he, alone in his bakehouse, will continue shaping dough for earthly hunger. A different kind of devotion, but devotion nonetheless. The dough beneath his palms grows smoother as he works, its earlier stickiness fading little by little. Each push of his hands presses warmth into it, shaping it from a rough mixture into something with form and purpose. There is comfort in this transformation, a familiarity as old as the medieval world itself, for bread-making was a rhythm shared by nearly every household, every monastery, every village oven. The baker inhales the mingled scent of barley, oat, and lingering smoke from the hearth, allowing the fragrance to settle soft and steady in the cool morning air. He pauses to roll his shoulders, feeling the faint crackle in his joints. He is not old, not yet, but years in the bakehouse leave their own quiet marks, thickened palms, a stoop in the back, a calm slowness in every movement. He has lived many mornings like this one, and yet the work never feels stale. Bread, even common bread, always begins as something raw and uncertain, becoming only what his hands make of it. As the barley oat dough begins to tighten beneath his fingers, he lifts his head and listens. The chanting from the chapel grows faint, replaced by the muffled footsteps of monks or clerics moving to and fro inside their stone sanctuary. The service is underway. He imagines the sacred loaf resting now on the altar, its pale surface illuminated by flickering candlelight. He imagines the priest lifting it with deliberate stillness, reciting ancient words that echo through vaulted arches. That same loaf, fragile yet revered, will soon be broken before the attending faithful. The baker lets the thought settle, then returns to his task. He divides the dough into smaller portions, shaping each one into rounded loaves. The barley oat mixture is softer than rye and sometimes cracks along the edges, so he smooths each loaf with patient hands, coaxing the dough into unity. He lines them up along a wooden board, their surfaces slightly uneven, their textures rustic, the kind of bread that might be eaten by lower servants, stable workers, or even travelers stopping briefly at the castle gates. When he covers these loaves with a cloth, he takes care to fold the linen lightly, allowing room for the faint rise that will follow. Then he steps back, letting his eyes rest on the rows of dough beneath their linen canopy. There is something calming about this sight, the quiet promise of bread resting, waiting, breathing before the fire finishes its work. He moves next to the storage shelves, checking sacks of flour. The wheat sack is lighter than usual, its top slightly loosened by the previous morning's work. Pure wheat is precious, used sparingly, reserved mostly for the Lord's table, guests of high status, and the chapel's sacramental needs. He lifts the sack gently, judging its weight with a practiced motion. Enough remains for perhaps a few more days of the finest loaves. After that, the steward must arrange a new delivery from the nearest town or monastery mill. In the Middle Ages, wheat was not always plentiful. Poor harvests, harsh winters, or war could make wheat scarce. The lives of bakers and households alike depended intimately on the rhythms of the seasons. A year of good weather meant lighter, more flavorful bread. A year of storms or drought could bring darker loaves, stretched with other grains or ground less finely. The baker has lived through such years. Years when flour arrived in coarse, uneven textures, when the smell of damp grain hinted at mold, when the air in the bakehouse grew heavy with the worry shared across the castle. He runs his fingers through the remaining wheat now, relieved to find it clean and dry, each grain ground into soft pale powder. It clings lightly to his skin, forming a faint dust that makes him smile. Wheat flour feels different from rye or barley. Finer, softer, almost silky. He sets the sack down carefully and wipes his hands on his apron, leaving pale smudges across the heavy cloth. The fire behind him crackles softly, sending up tiny sparks that die long before reaching the chimney. The air warms a little more. He turns back to the rye loaves, checking their rise. They have spread slightly, their surfaces lightly domed beneath the cloth. Rye rises less dramatically than wheat, but he knows by touch alone when it is ready for the oven. He lifts the cloth, presses the side of one loaf gently, watches how the dough springs back slowly. Yes, nearly ready. He fetches the long-handled peel once more, testing the oven's heat again. This time, the stones glow with an even warmth, the kind that promises a slow, thorough bake. For rye, the oven must be neither too fierce nor too mild. A steady heat is key. He sweeps the oven floor lightly, removing any lingering ash left from the earlier bake, then dusts the peel with flour. One by one, he slides the rye loaves into the oven, each one settling onto the stone with a soft, muted sound. There is satisfaction in this part of the work. Not dramatic, but deeply grounding. The oven door closes, sealing in the warmth. The baker steps back, inhaling the faint aroma that begins to lift, even though the loaves have barely started to bake. Rye has an earthy, comforting smell, a scent peasants would associate with home, routine, and the dependability of grain. He wipes sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The bakehouse grows warmer as the morning advances. Light from the small windows grows brighter, creeping across the stone floor in elongated patches. Dust motes drift lazily through the air, swirling whenever he moves. He watches them for a moment, little particles suspended in silence, dancing in the sunlight as though time is momentarily slowing just for them. He turns to the table where the next set of loaves waits. The barley oat dough is softer, still rising slowly. He lifts a corner of the cloth to check on them, lowering it again with satisfaction. The morning will continue like this, a rhythm of kneading, shaping, firing, cooling, a living cycle that repeats with comforting predictability. Outside, the courtyard fills with more activity. A clatter of armor signals soldiers preparing for their morning duties. A servant laughs quietly at something whispered by another. Horses snort and stamp in their stalls. Somewhere near the gate, the sound of a merchant's cart creaks as goods are unloaded. Perhaps sacks of grain, bundles of herbs, or barrels of ale. Life in a medieval castle is never still for long, but the bakehouse remains its own pocket of calm. Even in times of tension, war, or uncertainty, bread must be made. People must eat. The castle depends on this small room more than many realize. The baker reflects on this as he polishes a wooden bowl or stirs a mixture of flour and water. His hands stay busy, but his mind drifts gently, carried by the steady hum of the oven. Hours pass quietly. The rye loaves begin to form their crusts, their aromas deepening. He opens the oven briefly, turning the loaves with his peel so they bake evenly. Steam rises from their surfaces, and he leans closer, letting the warmth brush across his face. There is something soothing about this. The steady heat, the steady scent, the feeling of being surrounded by work that asks for patience rather than haste. He closes the oven again with a soft thud and moves back to the table. The barley oat loaves lift slightly beneath the cloth now, their shapes rounded and promising. He will bake them next, once the rye loaves leave the oven. The cycle continues, each step blending into the next with the calm inevitability of a tide returning to shore. The chanting from the chapel ends at last, giving way to a deep stillness across the castle. The service has concluded. The sacred loaf has been broken, distributed, consumed. Somewhere in the shadows of the stone sanctuary, a lingering scent of beeswax candles and incense might still hover, mingling with the faint sweetness of wheat bread. The baker smiles quietly at the thought. His hands may never touch the consecrated loaf again once it leaves the bakehouse, but he knows its place in the rhythm of faith. Just as he knows the place of rye in a soldier's pack, barley in a monk's meal, oats in a peasant's hearth. Bread is the thread that binds all lives here. Humble, essential, sacred in its own way. You may hear in the back of your imagination that gentle thump, thump, thump of dough being folded again. It is a rhythm so steady that even the castle guards, those who rarely notice anything unless it gleams or threatens, sometimes pause when passing the kitchen corridor. They never speak of it, but there is something in the sound that settles their shoulders, as if the baker's early morning work hums through the stone walls and quiets the fortress itself. Today, this day we are drifting through together. The dough is ready for shaping. It glistens faintly under the pale shimmer of a tallow candle. The baker draws the wooden bowl closer, brushes aside a few specks of flour that cling to his forearms, and breathes out through his nose slowly, as if steadying himself. Shaping isn't hurried in these centuries. It is a gesture of patience learned across generations. He pulls the dough forward, folds it once, twice, and presses it into a round. The surface, a little uneven, a little rustic, is perfect precisely because it is not perfect. Medieval bread carried the imprint of hands, of soil, of weather, of seasons. Nothing was standardized. Everything was alive. As you picture that rough, warm dough, still holding the memory of oak-wood heat near the hearth, imagine the faint aroma rising, slightly sour, slightly nutty. A fragrance not of sweetness but of earth and grain, the kind that would cling to the air long after the baker had moved on to the next loaf. He lifts the rounded dough and places it on a board dusted with coarse flour. The grains of that flour are larger than modern ones, coarser, almost sandy. Grinding was a labor of its own, done with stone mills that left tiny traces of grit behind. It wasn't a flaw. It was simply the truth of the era. People bit into bread knowing that the land itself lived inside it. Outside the kitchen, the castle is beginning to stir. Footsteps on the wooden gallery. A cough from a stable boy leading horses out for watering. A quiet murmur from the chapel, where the priest has begun preparing the morning liturgy. It is this liturgy that binds the baker's work today. The bread for the Lord's table must be ready long before the nobles take their seats for breakfast. But the bread for the altar is not entirely separate from the bread for the castle. Both come from the same dough, the same fields, the same hands. Only the portion set aside for the chapel is handled with a slight shift in intention. Slower, gentler, as if the baker's fingertips speak a prayer more ancient than his voice could manage. He wipes the board with his palm and takes a second piece of dough, lighter in weight, meant specifically for the chapel. It will be baked on a flatter stone, with an imprint made by a carved wooden seal. This seal, kept in a linen wrap, bears a simple cross surrounded by a ring of small geometric shapes. Not elaborate, not gilded, but cherished. It belonged to his grandfather, who had baked for this same castle. The baker unwraps the seal and touches the carved surface. His thumb fits naturally against a small indentation worn smooth by decades of use. Then, pressing it carefully into the dough, he holds his breath the way all bakers do in this moment. Not for fear of mistake, but because the gesture is sacred in its quietness. The imprint appears. Shallow, clear, rustic. He lifts the seal away slowly and sets the marked dough on its own small board. The candlelight trembles with a soft draft, making the cross seem to flicker in and out of visibility, like a memory. And now he waits, because bread, especially bread meant for the Lord's table, cannot be rushed. While it rests, the baker begins gathering the tools he will need for tending the fire. The oak ashes from yesterday's bake are still warm at the pit's base. He stirs them with a metal poker, listening to the faint crackle that rises like a whisper of yesterday's flames. The oven beside the hearth is a dome of hardened clay and brick, built into the wall. Its opening is narrow, its interior dark, but its capacity to hold heat is extraordinary. He adds thin slats of oak and alder wood, arranged in a cross-hatched pattern to catch easily. Soon the crackling grows louder, a small, eager flame licking upward, then settling into a steady burn. The scent is subtle, woody, dry, comforting. In medieval kitchens, fire dictated everything. Not the baker, not the clock, not the ritual, only the fire. And so he moves with its rhythm, glancing at the flames occasionally while polishing the long-handled peel, the wooden tool used to slide loaves into the oven. It is smooth from years of hands gliding along its length. On its underside are faint scorch marks, shadows from countless bakes. He runs his hand along the handle, feeling each groove left by time. Outside, the sound of bells begins. The bell for prime, the early morning prayer. It hums across the valley, soft at first, then clearer as the wind shifts. The baker pauses instinctively, bowing his head just slightly. This bell is his cue. The dough should be ready to move closer to the fire. He checks it by pressing a fingertip lightly against its surface. The dough responds with a slow rise back, soft but resilient. Perfect. He shapes it once more, gently tightening its surface by pulling the edges beneath, a technique that medieval bakers learned from watching and imitating, not from reading instructions. Then, lifting the first round loaf, he turns toward the oven. The fire is hotter now, spreading heat into the clay walls. He waits because the timing is delicate. Too soon and the crust will harden before the inside expands. Too late and the heat will fade. And while he waits, footsteps approach the kitchen doorway. Soft, hesitant ones. A young novice from the chapel stands there, cloak half fastened, cheeks flushed from the morning chill. The priest asks if the altar loaf will be ready before terce. The boy says softly. The baker nods without turning fully. "It will," he replies in a voice low enough to blend with the fire's breath. The novice lingers a moment, as if mesmerized by the quiet routine unfolding in the warm room, then slips away, fabric brushing stone. The baker places the first loaf into the oven, then the second, the altar loaf. The firelight flares softly against the dough's pale surface, then dims as he withdraws the peel. He closes the oven's wooden door, leaving only a small gap for the smoke to curl out. Minutes stretch. The smell of baking bread begins to build, slow, thick, comforting. And somewhere in the castle, someone begins humming a melody that might be centuries old. The tune floats down the hallway, barely audible, but the baker hears it. He always does. It is the melody sung by fieldworkers at planting season, the same rhythm that lives in the kneading of dough. As freshness fills the kitchen, the baker's eyes soften. The bread for the Lord's table is nearly ready. The scent deepens, warm, grain-rich, tinged with the faintest hint of oak smoke. It drifts upward into the rafters of the kitchen, slides beneath doors, curls around corners. Medieval castles were full of strong smells, animals, tallow, damp stone. But on baking mornings, this one fragrance slipped through everything like a gentle thread, pulling even the most tired minds a little closer to calm. The baker lifts the wooden peel again, not hurried, not slow, simply in tune with the steady breath of the oven. He nudges the door open, and a wave of heat rolls out, soft at first and then blooming across his face like the warmth of a midsummer field. Inside, the 2 loaves have begun to expand, their surfaces cracking slightly as the crust forms. The cross-marked loaf, the one meant for the Lord's table, has its imprint still visible, though the heat has softened its edges. He watches without blinking. This moment, the first rise beneath fire, is something he never rushes. For a medieval baker, attention to these small signs is everything. A burn here, a collapse there. Each mistake tells a story, and each success carries the echo of many mornings before. He closes the oven again, letting the bread settle deeper into its transformation. Behind him, the castle maids begin their day's quiet tasks. One enters carrying baskets of laundry, her footsteps gentle on the reed-strewn floor. Another comes in from the courtyard with a pail of water, the surface trembling with every movement. They work silently around the baker, accustomed to his early morning presence, respectful of the rhythm he maintains. Their silence is not fear, it is tradition. The baker's domain at morning was considered almost sacred. The rising of bread was too close to the rising of prayer to be disturbed. One of the maids, older, with hair wrapped in a faded kerchief, pauses by the hearth. She holds her palms toward its warmth, sighs softly, and closes her eyes as the heat loosens the stiffness in her joints. The baker glances at her briefly. He doesn't speak, but his expression softens in a way that says she is welcome to stay there as long as she needs. The fire snaps, sending a brief cascade of sparks into the oven's shadowed interior. The sound is quick, bright, and gone in an instant. Outside, the castle's courtyard begins to stir. A horse neighs. Metal clangs. Perhaps a sword being lifted from a rack. 2 voices exchange sleepy greetings. The sun has fully breached the horizon now, though its light still feels pale and cool against the earth. The baker knows that once the loaves are ready, they must rest before being carried to their destinations. Bread meant for ritual must never be cut while hot. It must be offered whole, unbroken, warm only in spirit. He reaches up to a shelf and takes down a cloth, woven linen, slightly worn but clean. It is the cloth he uses every morning for this same task. Carefully, he folds it so that it forms a soft cradle for the still baking loaf when the moment comes. The fabric smells faintly of lavender, placed in the storage chest by the maids to keep moths away. He sets the folded cloth on the table and checks the small window slit to gauge the light. The castle walls are thick enough that sunlight creeps in muted and narrow, creating a single pale stripe across the wall. That stripe now falls just slightly lower than his elbow, exactly where it should be at this point in the bake. He opens the oven. This time, the aroma that escapes is heavier, richer. The crust on the first loaf has turned a deep, rustic brown, speckled with the grains of flour and tiny pieces of oat or rye that had clung to the dough. The second loaf, the altar loaf, is lighter in shade, deliberately so. It was baked slightly cooler, allowing it to remain pale and mild, a symbolic counterpart to the darker, heartier loaves of the household. He slides the peel inside and touches the bottom of the first loaf gently. Hollow sound comes back, soft but sure, the sign of readiness. Carefully, he lifts the round loaf and places it on the table. Next comes the altar loaf. He handles it with extra caution, sliding it directly onto the linen cloth. The imprint of the cross has puffed up slightly, but remains clear enough to be recognized even by those who see it only at the moment of blessing. Steam rises gently from both loaves. It twists upward like white, delicate threads, disappearing slowly as cooler air embraces it. The baker stands still, watching the steam curl, as though it is part of the ritual itself. From the chapel corridor, the sound of footsteps approaches, slow, purposeful. These are the steps of someone older, someone accustomed to walking with intention. The priest enters the kitchen doorway, robes gathered slightly at his sides to avoid catching on the wooden frame. He nods to the baker, a greeting both simple and weighted with familiarity. "Is it ready?" the priest asks quietly. The baker gestures toward the linen-wrapped loaf. "It is cooling now, Father," he replies. The priest steps closer, inhaling the warm scent. His face softens, eyes lowering as though in reflection. Bread for the altar was not just a symbol to him. It was a direct connection to the earth, the village, the hands that shaped it, the fields that gave it. In this world, spirituality and labor were intertwined so tightly that neither could truly be separated from the other. "You've done well," the priest murmurs, though he says the same thing every morning. The baker simply nods, accepting the words as part of the daily exchange. The priest does not take the loaf yet. He waits, understanding that the bread must be handled at the right moment, when it has shed its heat enough to be held without steaming its cloth. He folds his hands and stands quietly by the table, eyes drifting to the fire. There is a calmness in the room now, thick, warm calm, the kind that feels like a blanket drawn just slightly over the shoulders. The priest eventually steps closer and lifts the linen cloth by its corners. The loaf inside barely shifts, its weight centered, its warmth still alive. He gives the baker one last small nod before turning to leave, carrying the loaf with the same solemn care one might carry a sleeping child. After he leaves, the baker lets out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The completion of the altar loaf always carried a quiet tension. Not fear, not pressure, but the sense of participating in something older than any one person. Then, with the priest gone, the baker turns toward the remaining loaf, the one meant for the castle's table. He smiles slightly. It is a good loaf today, the kind that will feed guards and servants alike, giving them the strength to face whatever tasks the day demands. He sets it aside to cool, and the fire crackles again, softer this time as though satisfied. The castle morning gradually turns from a hush into a hum, and the baker, still warmed from the oven's breath, steps back to his work table, where the second loaf rests like a quiet promise. The crust, cooling now, makes tiny sounds, soft crackles, almost like the sighs of someone easing into sleep. Medieval bread did this often. As the hot air escaped the crust, it whispered these faint, fragile noises that only those close enough and calm enough would ever hear. The baker listens. He always listens. These soft crackles remind him that the loaf is settling, firming, becoming what it must be before hungry hands slice into it. Though knives of this era were sharp, the bread was sturdy, hearty grain, uneven textures, a reflection of the fields and mills that birthed it. Nothing like the cloud-soft loaves of modern imagination. This bread had weight, a presence. Outside the kitchen door, the low murmur of conversation rises. Servants passing by, carrying pails or linens or tools. Their voices carry fragments of morning gossip, concerns about the weather, a rumor from the village, a horse said to be limping after last night's patrol. It all drifts past in gentle waves, never fully intruding into the sanctuary of the kitchen. The baker wipes flour from his palms and reaches for a wooden ladle resting near the hearth. There is a pot warming there, porridge for the youngest servants who will need energy before their chores. Though this is not his main responsibility, the baker tends to it with the same steady patience. Food was rarely one person's job in medieval life. The castle kitchen was interwoven with duties that overlapped, each task supporting another. He stirs the pot slowly. Thick grains swirl in the warm mixture. The fire's glow reflects across the surface, turning the porridge a soft golden tone. You can imagine the warmth of that rising steam, the way it blends with the scent of the baked loaves until the entire kitchen becomes a tapestry of heat and nourishment. It is a warmth that seeps into the bones, even into the stone walls, ancient stones that have felt centuries of mornings like this. But the baker's focus soon returns to the loaf on the table. It is cool enough now. Not cold, not stiff, just quiet and ready. He lifts it with both hands, thumbs resting against the bottom, fingertips curving gently along the crust. Even through the rough exterior, he feels the slight give beneath, a sign of a well-made crumb. He turns it once, inspecting it the way his father taught him, rolling it just enough to check for uneven bakes or thin spots. Satisfied, he sets it down again with a soft thud. A few moments later, the sound of boots approaches. Heavier footsteps this time, purposeful rather than drifting. A guard appears in the doorway, helmet tucked under his arm, posture straight out of habit more than need. He nods to the baker. "Is it ready?" he asks, not brusque, just formal. The baker gestures to the loaf. "You may take it to the hall," he says quietly. The guard steps forward and lifts the bread with a care that contrasts his rugged armor. Even those who spent their days training with swords understood the value of food. Bread was more than nourishment. In many ways, it was life itself. He nods in thanks and carries the loaf away, leaving the kitchen briefly empty again. The baker wipes his table clean, brushing aside stray crumbs and flour dust. Then, as is his habit, he pauses. This moment, the silence after both loaves have left his hands, is one of the rare still points in his day. He looks toward the small slit window where sunlight now slants in at a sharper angle. Dust motes drift lazily through the beam, rising and falling like tiny weightless embers. Their motion is slow, hypnotic. Many mornings, the baker watches them for a breath or two, letting his mind rest before the next tasks call him away. The castle is fully awake now. Horses clatter in the courtyard. The smith's hammer begins its rhythmic striking from somewhere near the outer wall. Steady, resonant, metallic. Cooks begin arriving in pairs, preparing for the noon meal. Some carry baskets filled with root vegetables, others jugs of ale, still others bundles of herbs wrapped in cloth. The baker greets each one with a nod or a quiet murmur. Words are not always needed between those who work beside each other every day. Routine often takes the place of conversation. One of the cooks, a tall woman with streaks of gray at her temples, approaches the fire and glances inside the still warm oven. "A fine bake today," she remarks softly. He shrugs slightly, a gesture of modesty. "It rose well," he replies. "May it continue to," she says, as though offering a small blessing, then returns to her chopping board. Her knife begins a steady rhythm. Tap, 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 cutting onions with practiced skill. The scent of them soon lifts into the air, sharp but bright, cleansing the heaviness of the room for a moment. The baker steps away from the hearth and toward the storage shelves where sacks of grain rest. He checks each one, feeling the weight, the consistency. Medieval grain supplies were precious. Any sign of dampness or spoilage was taken seriously. Loss of grain was not just an inconvenience. It could mean hunger during winter. He presses his fingers into one sack, testing the dryness of the barley. Then the rye. Then the wheat. All appear sound. He exhales with relief. The season has been merciful so far. Outside, another bell tolls. Terse, the mid-morning prayer. It echoes across the valley with a soft persistence, rolling through the castle corridors, brushing against the baker's ears like a reminder. He pauses, setting aside his work. Many of the castle's inhabitants will attend the service. But for the baker, his prayer is woven into his labor. Still, he stands quietly for a moment, letting the sound anchor him. The bell's vibration is warm, full, and steady. When it fades, he returns to preparing the dough for later meals. Though the altar loaf and the main loaf are finished, the day continues with smaller batches. Flatbreads for the servants, coarse trenchers for the dining hall, simple rounds for travelers or messengers who might arrive unexpectedly. As he begins mixing again, the rhythm returns. The soft scrape of wooden bowl against table, the rustle of flour settling, the gradual shift of dough forming under his hands. Outside the door, two children, apprentices in training, pass through with buckets clanking faintly. One slows near the doorway, peeking in with wide eyes. The baker looks up briefly and nods. Encouraged, the youth smiles before hurrying to catch up to the older apprentice. Bread making was respected, even a little mysterious, to those who did not yet understand it. The dough grows heavier under his palms as he kneads, folding and pressing, folding and pressing. His motions are unhurried, almost meditative. The fire hums, the castle breathes, the morning deepens, and the baker continues, grounded in the ancient, simple rhythm of transforming grain and water into sustenance. The dough beneath his hands grows warmer as he kneads, responding to each fold with a gentle resistance. Medieval kitchens were colder than most imagine, drafts slipping through stone cracks, corners untouched by hearth heat. But dough always carried its own living warmth, faint and steady, like a heartbeat under flour. He presses the heel of his palm into it, slowly, methodically. Fold, press, turn. A rhythm older than memory. Each movement creates a quiet sound, soft, padded, almost like footsteps muffled by fresh snow. The baker listens to it with a subtle, inward focus. These sounds tell him whether the dough needs more water, or more rest, or a firmer touch. It is a language he has spoken since childhood, one he learned before he ever learned to read. Behind him the kitchen grows busier. A pot is set onto the fire with a careful thump. A wooden spoon clatters in a bowl. A maid laughs briefly at something whispered by another. The day's work has begun to spool outward, faster now. Still the baker moves at his own pace. His role is never frantic. Bread refuses haste. It answers only to patience, heat, and the careful balance of hand and time. When the dough is ready, he sets it aside beneath a cloth to rest. The cloth is coarse, woven by someone in the village, dyed lightly with herbs to keep moths away. He drapes it gently over the bowl, tucking the edges in as though covering a sleeping child. Then he steps back and rinses his hands in a small basin of cool water, letting flour swirl into pale clouds before settling. The water smells faintly of mint, something the servants add to keep it fresh, and the coolness eases the warmth in his palms. As he dries his hands, the side door to the kitchen opens, letting in a brief gust of crisp morning air. A stable boy slips inside carrying a small wooden crate. Inside the crate, wrapped in thin cloths, are eggs from the castle's hens. They are not uniform in color. Some are pale, nearly white, while others are speckled or tinted with tan. Diversity was normal in medieval life, nothing yet shaped into standardized perfection. The boy places the crate near the table and nods awkwardly. "From the coop, sir. Fresh this morning." The baker nods in return, his voice low. "Thank you." The boy lingers for a moment, drawn by the warmth of the kitchen, the scent of rising dough, the comfort of routine. The baker notices but says nothing. Young workers were often overwhelmed by the cold and noise of the outer yards. The kitchen's calm seemed to gather them naturally, offering a few moments of quiet refuge. Eventually, the boy slips back out, closing the door softly. The baker moves toward the shelves again, selecting a sack of coarser grain for the trenchers, the thick, stale-style bread pieces used as plates during meals. Trenchers were never meant to be luxurious. They were functional, soaking up juices and sauces before being eaten by servants or given to the poor. Yet even these required care. He pours the grain into a wide wooden bowl and adds water slowly, stirring with a sturdy spoon until the mixture thickens. It is not smooth, and it is not meant to be. Medieval trenchers were dense, almost hard, sturdy enough to hold meat and broth without dissolving. The stirring creates a wet, earthy sound, like mud being shaped by hand. It is strangely grounding. Near the hearth, the cook with gray at her temples begins slicing herbs. She works in silence, her knife gliding through sprigs of parsley and thyme. Their scent releases into the warm air, bright and green. In a room full of grain and smoke, the herbs add a sharp whisper of freshness. Another cook enters with a pot of broth. The smell drifts outward, rich, savory, comforting. The baker glances toward the pot, recognizing the aroma of bones that have simmered overnight. Nothing in medieval kitchens was wasted. Broth was a way of stretching nourishment from every scrap. He returns to his doze. The resting dough beneath the cloth has relaxed, spreading slightly under its own weight. When he presses his fingertips lightly into the surface, the indent remains before lifting slowly. Perfect. It is ready to be shaped for the noon meal. He dusts the table with flour and turns the dough out onto it. Thud. Gentle sigh of settling. He presses and folds it again, but these motions are lighter now. Shaping, not kneading. You can imagine the baker's hands here. Slow, deliberate, guided by instinct. Every curve and crease of the dough receives attention. It is almost like sculpting, but softer, warmer. Outside, the sounds of the castle deepen. Metal on metal from the smithy, the distant neigh of a horse, footsteps moving in choreographed patterns. The hum of daily life wraps around the kitchen walls like a low, steady drone. Soon, from somewhere down the hall, faint chants begin drifting from the chapel. The priest's voice blends with the choir of young novices. Their words, sung in Latin, weave gently through the air. Long vowels, quiet harmonics, rising and falling in slow waves. It is the service during which the altar loaf will be used. The baker pauses, listening. Though he cannot see it, he imagines it clearly. The linen cloth being lifted, the cross-marked bread placed upon the altar, the light from narrow windows illuminating its pale crust. Those attending stand still, hands clasped, voices low. It is a moment created not by preaching alone but by the quiet, steady labor that began long before sunrise. The baker breathes out softly. There is a silent satisfaction in knowing his hands have contributed to something sacred. The chanting continues. Soft, echoing, strangely calming. He resumes shaping the dough, forming long rounds and shorter pieces meant for specific uses. He arranges them on wooden boards, each spaced evenly to rise. The air in the kitchen grows warmer as the fire strengthens for the midday cooking. Time stretches gently. Not rushed, not idle, just steady. A maid approaches him with a small question about how much bread will be needed for the afternoon meal. He answers briefly, and she scribbles the number onto a wax tablet with a blunt stylus. Then she hurries away. The baker focuses once more on the dough. The warmth of the kitchen causes it to rise quickly, tiny bubbles forming beneath the surface. He presses one lightly with the edge of his thumb, feeling the delicate pushback. Soon he will return to the oven. The fire, crackling softly, waits with a patient hunger, ready to turn this dough into sustenance for dozens of people. For now, though, the baker simply watches the dough expand. It is a quiet moment, a small, intimate gift in the middle of a busy castle day. And as the chanting fades into silence, he knows the altar loaf has already been blessed, offered, shared, honored. His work continues, but a part of the morning has already become memory. The dough rests again, rising beneath the linen cloth as gently as a breath drawn in sleep. The baker steps away from the table and moves toward the oven, gauging its heat by holding his hand near the opening. Not close enough to burn, just near enough to feel the temperature radiating outward. Medieval bakers did not have thermometers. They tested heat by instinct, by hand, by the wisdom passed down quietly through generations. He studies the fire, the glowing bed of embers, the tongue-like flickers of flame that still dance along the inner curve of the dome. He notes the color, the movement, the crackling pace. Oak burns slower than birch, with a steadier, richer heat. The baker has learned these differences not by study, but by long familiarity, much the way one learns the breathing patterns of someone they live beside. The fire hums. The room warms further, and in that shifting glow, he prepares himself for the next bake. Behind him, the kitchen continues its layered rhythms. Pots simmer, knives tap. A broom sweeps gently near the doorway. These sounds layer over the heartbeat of the fire, creating a subtle, unintentional symphony of work that medieval castles knew well. The baker turns back to the dough. It has risen beautifully, soft, full, rounded at the edges. He lifts the linen cloth, folds it carefully, and sets it aside so flour dust falls lightly to the table like powdery snow. Then he reaches into the bowl with both hands, lifting the dough and allowing it to stretch under its own weight. It droops slightly, yielding to gravity, and he turns it over to press the air out gently. Shaping comes next. He divides the dough into sections, some small, some larger, depending on their purpose. Each one he rounds with practiced hands, tucking edges beneath and smoothing the tops until they resemble small hills of grain-colored clay. The table becomes a quiet landscape of rising mounds. You can picture his hands here, sturdy, scarred in tiny ways from years near hot ovens, but graceful in movement. The way he touches each shaped piece seems almost like a blessing, firm but gentle. A young kitchen helper stops nearby, watching with quiet fascination. She is small, maybe 9 or 10, with sleeves rolled too high and hair tied back with uneven twine. She clasps her hands behind her back, leaning in slightly as though not wanting to disturb the dough with her presence. The baker notices her and nods to one of the smaller dough pieces. "You may shape this one," he says softly. Her eyes widen. She steps forward, barely breathing, and places her hands on the dough as though touching a newborn bird. She copies his motions, awkward at first, then steadier, and slowly rounds the dough, tucking it with a shy pride. The baker watches, offering a small correction with a motion of his hand. When she finishes, the dough is imperfect, uneven, slightly lumpy, but it is hers. It holds her effort, her nervousness, her learning. He places it on the board with the others, not separating it, not marking it. Here, even flawed attempts become part of the meal, part of the flow of work, part of the castle's daily sustenance. The girl smiles faintly and returns to her tasks, cheeks tinted with warmth. The baker begins preparing the oven for the new loaves. He uses a long-handled broom made of bundled twigs to sweep out stray ash from the oven floor. The movement stirs a faint cloud of gray dust, which floats for a moment before settling again into the stone. The oven's interior glows softly, an earthy reddish-orange light that wavers with each shift of the embers. He waits for the right moment. Bread placed too soon will scorch. Bread placed too late will flatten. Timing matters in ways that cannot be written down. The cooks gather their own ingredients nearby. Barrels of barley, woven baskets of onions, baskets of herbs tied with twine. The scents mingle, earth, smoke, metal, green freshness, and the baker feels the comfort of a space where every aroma has its purpose. After several minutes, he reaches for the peel, the long wooden board that slides bread into the oven. He touches the oven's edge and nods to himself. The heat is just right. He lifts the first shaped dough piece, sliding it carefully onto the peel. Then the next, and the next. Soon the peel holds several rounds, arranged neatly. In the soft glow of the oven, each piece of dough looks like a small sun rising. He slides the peel forward. The loaves enter the oven in one smooth motion. A soft scrape of wood against stone. A subtle thump as the dough settles on the hot surface. The peel sliding back with a faint whisper. Loaves begin to bake. The air changes almost immediately. The smell of warming grain lifts into the kitchen. Slow at first, then richer, fuller. It blends with the scent already lingering from the morning's altar loaf, deepening the warmth in the room until the air feels almost thick with comfort. The baker places the peel down and steps back, watching the doorway as a faint breeze from the hallway carries a draft across the floor. It stirs the flour on the table, lifting it just slightly before letting it settle again. A guard passes by and pauses. "Smells good today," he murmurs. The baker nods. He has heard this same comment nearly every day, but it always arrives differently. Sometimes hopeful, sometimes weary, sometimes joking. Today, it carries a tone of appreciation, as though the scent itself is a balm after a long night watch. As the bread bakes, the baker sits on a small wooden stool near the hearth, the only moment of rest he allows himself during the day. He doesn't fully relax. His eyes stay half-focused on the oven door, listening for the small signs that only someone in his trade could ever notice. A faint crack inside the oven. A deep pop of a crust forming. A shift in the oven's hum as the moisture escapes the dough. Each sound tells him how much time remains. Cooks bustle around him, but they know not to ask him questions in these moments. The baker in mid-bake is both present and distant, like someone halfway inside a dream. Gradually, the oven releases a slightly sweeter scent. The loaves are close. He rises, retrieves the peel, and opens the oven door. Heat washes out. Strong, steady orange. The loaves have risen beautifully, their crusts cracking in rustic lines, their tops dusted with a flour that has baked into pale freckles. He taps one with the end of a finger. The hollow sound answers back clearly. Ready. One by one, he lifts them out, placing them onto the table where the air is cooler. They steam gently, white tendrils lifting, drifting, fading. The kitchen pauses for a breath. Everyone notices this moment, even if they do not speak of it. Fresh bread has a way of commanding quiet. The baker stands over the loaves, allowing himself a rare small smile. They will feed dozens today. Workers, guards, traveling merchants, servants, children. Each loaf is a piece of the castle's living rhythm. And as he looks at them, the memory of the altar loaf flickers in his thoughts. Already blessed, already shared. Part of the morning's story completed, part continuing now in these new rounds. The day moves on, but the bread's warmth lingers like a gentle hum under everything. The loaves cool on the table, their crusts shifting softly as they settle, tiny cracks forming like the delicate lines of old parchment. The baker lets his hand hover above them, not touching yet, just feeling the warmth rising upward in soft waves. This stage always feels like a quiet promise, the midpoint between creation and nourishment. The kitchen around him has grown louder as the morning reaches its fuller pace. Pots clatter, water splashes, and someone in the far corner laughs quickly before stifling the sound, as though remembering that the baker's space asks for a gentler tone while the bread rests. Despite the bustle, there's a pocket of calm around the cooling table, as if the bread itself creates a circle of hush. The baker wipes his hands on his apron, the fabric stiffened by years of flour and heat. He turns to gather the remaining ingredients for the next batch. Barley flour, a small sack of rye, and a jar containing the sour-smelling starter that gives the bread its character. In medieval times, yeast wasn't sold in tidy cubes or measured out in packets. It lived in these jars, bubbles rising lazily on the surface, carrying traces of every loaf baked in the past. A living memory, tied to countless dawns. As he opens the jar, the scent rises, sharp, tangy, a little wild. He stirs it gently, listening to the faint fizz. The starter is active today, eager, and he nods as though acknowledging a familiar friend. A hand taps lightly on the doorframe. It's the steward. His expression somewhere between polite urgency and weariness. Another delivery arrived, he says, shifting a cloth-wrapped parcel in his hands. Grain from the lower farms. They say the road was muddy this morning. The baker takes the parcel, feeling the weight. Grain deliveries always carry a story with them. Weather, travel, labor, sometimes trouble. He unwraps the cloth enough to pinch a few grains between his fingers. They are clean, golden, slightly cool to the touch. Good harvest, he asks. Fair, the steward replies. Better than last year, they claim. The baker nods. Last year had been difficult. Poor rains had thinned the fields, and many mornings he had stretched dough further than he liked. Bread was never absent, but sometimes it was sparse, dense, or sourer than usual, shaped by necessity rather than craft. Today's grain looks kinder. He can feel the difference. He sets the new parcel aside and returns to the mixing bowl. He pours the grain flour in slow arcs, watching the particles drift downward like drifting dust in a sunbeam. The rhythm of it steadies his breathing, and the rest of the kitchen seems to soften around him. Water follows, cool, drawn from the well moments ago. He pours it with care, the surface of the mixture darkening gradually. Then he adds a ladleful of the starter. It blends into the flour and water, brightening the mixture with life. He leans in with both hands, pressing, folding, drawing the dough inward. The texture is rough at first, uneven, but it yields gradually. Kneading in medieval kitchens was not a quick process. It was a long, patient movement, repeating the same gestures again and again until the dough softened beneath the hands. You can almost feel the pressure, the slow grind of palms, the gentle rotations of wrists. A rhythm that becomes a kind of quiet meditation. As he works, he glances toward the doorway where the helper girl returns, carrying a small bucket of water. She sets it beside him and lingers for a moment. The baker gestures to the cooling loaves. "Would you like to choose one to bring to the hall?" he asks in a low voice. Her face lights up. She steps forward and scans the loaves carefully, as though each one is a small treasure. Her hand hovers over several before choosing a medium-sized round with a slightly cracked top. "That one," she whispers. He nods. "Take it with both hands. And mind the steps." She lifts the loaf carefully, fingertips spread to balance its weight, and walks slowly out of the kitchen. The baker listens to her soft footsteps fade down the corridor. He imagines the moment she enters the great hall, the guards' amused smiles, the looks of hunger or gratitude from the people awaiting their morning meal. Bread held significance beyond nourishment. In a medieval castle, it was a symbol of reliability, of the day's structure, of the care that sustained the community. He shapes the new dough, smoothing its surface with practiced motions. The air is warmer now, carrying a low hum of activity. The baker turns to place the dough beneath a cloth for its first rise when suddenly a gust of wind presses against the shutters. The wood creaks. A faint rattle trembles through the windowsill. The baker pauses. Wind had picked up outside. Perhaps a storm was brewing over the valley. He steps closer to the small slit window, no wider than his hand, and peers out. The sky is a muted gray, with streaks of darker clouds drifting slowly, tugged by unseen currents. He studies them with the same seriousness he gives the oven. Weather matters deeply. A storm could soak the grain wagons, disrupt deliveries, and chill the kitchen. A damp day changes the dough, slowing its rise, altering its texture. He watches for several breaths, soft and steady, until he's certain the wind is passing, not building. The clouds shift westward. The light brightens by a shade. He returns to the dough, reassured. He checks the earlier loaves again. Their crusts are firmer now, cool enough to handle. He selects several, places them into a wide basket lined with linen, and ties the ends loosely to keep them warm. A guard will soon collect them for distribution across the castle. The workers tending the stables, the small group repairing the outer wall, the washerwomen laboring near the stream. Bread belongs everywhere. With the basket prepared, the baker pulls a small wooden stool beside the oven and sits for a brief moment. The heat against his shins is pleasant, almost lulling. He lets his eyes rest half-closed as the fire murmurs. The faint scent of oak embers shifts with each flicker of flame. Someone approaches quietly from behind. It is the steward again. "They've begun preparing the chapel for the midday prayers," he says softly. The priest asked if the next batch of altar bread could be brought sooner than usual. The baker nods, wiping his hands. "I'll have it ready." He knows the ritual. He knows the pacing. Bread for the Lord's table must arrive neither rushed nor late. He glances at the dough rising beneath the cloth and calculates quietly how long it needs, how warm the room is, how active the starter was today. Timing weaves itself into every decision he makes. He stands, stretches his back, and returns to work. The dough is rising well, smooth, slightly domed, delicate beneath his fingers. He presses one fingertip into its surface. The indentation lingers, soft and slow to spring back. Nearly ready. The baker breathes deeply, absorbing the moment. The warmth, the smell, the quiet, the sense of continuity that has guided bakers across centuries. This process, mixing, shaping, rising, baking, connects him not only to his own teacher before him but to countless unnamed bakers in monasteries, villages, castles, and towns. The dough waits patiently for his hands. The fire waits with its glowing breath. And the castle, with all its noise and need and fragile rhythms, waits for the bread that will sustain it. The dough rests beneath the linen cloth, barely rising and falling with the subtle shifts in the air, like a quiet breath sleeping in the warmth of the kitchen. The baker lifts one corner of the cloth to check the rise again. The surface is plump now, rounded and smooth, with tiny bubbles forming beneath the skin of the dough, evidence of the slow living work of the starter. He touches it gently, his fingertip leaving a shallow impression that lingers for several seconds. It is ready. He folds back the cloth entirely, letting the warm kitchen air wash over the dough's surface. The light from the oven touches the top, giving it a faint golden sheen. With both hands, he presses down to release the trapped air, soft puffs escaping in small, quiet sighs. The dough folds into itself, as if relaxing under his hands. The baker begins shaping the loaves meant for the chapel's midday prayers. These are simpler than the ones for the hall. Round, flattened slightly, plain on top. No marks, no designs. Their humility is deliberate, matching the tone of devotion expected at the altar. He dusts the table lightly with flour, then shapes each piece with the same even gentle pressure he has used every day for decades. While he works, the kitchen's sounds form their familiar tapestry. A knife thuds rhythmically as someone chops vegetables. Iron ladles clink softly against the rims of cauldrons. Two kitchen workers whisper in low voices, their words drifting like threads of cloth. Through the open door, faint echoes from the great hall drift in, the scrape of benches, distant chatter as people settle for their morning meal. The scent of cooked meat lingers in the corridor, but it never quite reaches the baker's station. Bread keeps its domain sacred somehow, protected by flour-dusted air. A gentle tapping interrupts his focus. He turns his head. An elderly man steps carefully into the kitchen. His clothing is simple, a worn wool tunic and a cloak clasped with a small wooden pin. His hair is thin and white, and he leans on a polished walking stick that seems older than he is. The baker recognizes him immediately, the castle's oldest servant, once a scribe, now a quiet presence who moves like a shadow through the halls. The man smiles faintly. "Is the chapel bread ready?" he asks, his voice thin but steady. "Nearly," the baker replies softly. Another moment of kneading. The old man nods and stands near the hearth, warming his hands. His knuckles are knotted, but his posture is still dignified. He gazes at the dough as though remembering something, perhaps a memory of bread being prepared in this same kitchen decades ago, when he was young and quick with ink-stained fingers. "You know," he says after a moment, "the first time I saw bread made was in a monastery. I remember thinking it looked like shaping clay. The monks called it the quiet art. I didn't understand then." He chuckles lightly. "I do now." The baker smiles. He does not speak. He simply continues shaping, letting the rhythm of his hands answer for him. The old man watches for a long moment, eyes softening with each fold of dough. When the shaping is finished, the baker places the small altar loaves on a wooden board, spaced evenly. They will not rise long, just enough to grow slightly fuller before entering the oven. He lifts the board and sets it near the hearth, where the warmth will coax the dough upward, encouraging its slow, steady breath. The old man steps closer. "Always the same," he murmurs. "No matter the years." The baker glances at him. "Bread doesn't change," he replies quietly. "Only the people around it." The old man's expression deepens with reflection, as if those words open a doorway to the past. He nods, tapping his walking stick gently against the stone floor. A gust of wind brushes against the shutters again, though softer this time, more like a wandering touch than a true disturbance. The old man turns slightly, listening. "The weather shifts early this year," he observes. "The valley feels restless." The baker continues preparing the peel for baking but nods in agreement. Restless, yes. But the grain was good this morning. That is something, the old man says, smiling. Good bread steadies people. Another quiet moment passes, filled only by the crackle of embers in the oven. The baker checks the altar loaves. They've risen enough. With slow precision, he slides them onto the peel. The old man steps back respectfully, as though aware that this part demands a kind of reverence. The baker approaches the oven. Heat washes outward in a soft rush, warming his face and hands. He leans forward slightly, noting the fire's state. The embers glow fiercely but steadily, perfect for the modest loaves, which need even heat rather than intense flame. He slides the loaves in. A whisper of steam escapes. The peel glides back out. The old man closes his eyes briefly, as though acknowledging the moment. The baker returns the peel to its place. Both men remain close to the oven, letting the warmth settle around them like a heavy blanket. The old man speaks again, his voice quiet. In the monastery, they told us bread was a symbol of promise. Not grand, not loud, but steady. A thing to remind us that life continues. The baker nods. There is truth in that. They fall silent again as the loaves bake. The scent changes gradually. Lighter, sweeter, softening into the air. The baker listens for the signs. The faint shift of crust forming. The subtle pop of air escaping. He notices the old man's shoulders relax as the aroma spreads, as though the very smell offers comfort. After a while, the baker opens the oven. The loaves are pale gold, round, humble, exactly as they should be. He removes them carefully, setting them on a small cloth. They steam gently, releasing ribbons of warmth that disappear into the air. The old man breathes in deeply, his expression peaceful. "They're beautiful," he says softly. "They will be ready for the prayers," the baker replies. The old man reaches out, not to touch the bread, but simply to hover his hand near it, feeling the warmth. Reverence without contact, respect without intrusion. When he straightens again, his voice softens. "I'll return shortly to take them to the chapel. You'll find them cooled by then," the baker says. "Perfect for carrying." The old man nods once more and begins his slow walk toward the door. His footsteps echo faintly before fading into the corridor. The baker watches him go, then turns his attention back to the remaining dough waiting for its next rise. The oven hums, the fire breathes, and the day moves on in its quiet rhythm, guided by the simple ancient craft of bread-making, one that steadies, nourishes, and anchors every life within the castle walls. The kitchen settles back into its steady rhythm after the old man's departure, as though the air itself exhales. The baker returns to the larger dough resting on the far end of the table, its surface now smoothed by rising. It has become rounder, lighter, almost buoyant under the cloth. When he lifts the linen again, the dough seems to greet him, alive, expanded, fuller in spirit and shape. He runs a slow hand over the top, feeling the subtle warmth within. "The room has been kind to you," he murmurs, almost to himself. Around him, the movement of the kitchen continues. A cook ladles broth into clay bowls, a washer scrubs a pot with brisk strokes, and someone kneads herbs between their fingers, releasing sharp green scents into the air. All of it blends into the layered, comforting soundtrack of a medieval morning. Work, purpose, continuity. The baker divides the dough into several large rounds for the noon meal. These loaves will be hearty, meant to feed laborers who will return from the fields or from work on the castle walls. Each loaf must be filling enough to carry someone through hours of labor. He cuts the dough with a wooden scraper, the blade gliding through with a soft hush, and portions fall neatly onto the table. He shapes them, rounding them with movements so familiar he could do them in darkness. The dough under his hands feels slightly different from this morning's first batch. More elastic, perhaps from the warmth rising outside, or maybe from the grain delivered at dawn. Medieval bread was never identical day to day. Small changes in weather, grain texture, and fire heat left their marks like quiet signatures. As he shapes, the helper girl returns. This time, she carries nothing. Her hands are clasped before her, fingers twitching anxiously as she approaches. "Master Baker?" she asks in a small voice. He looks down at her, patiently waiting. The steward says, "The hall wants more bread ready earlier. There are travelers today." "More than usual," the baker nods. Travelers require food, warmth, and often a place to rest their weary bodies. Sometimes merchants bringing goods, sometimes messengers carrying news from distant towns, sometimes wanderers seeking shelter from roads that stretch farther than most castle folk ever imagine. Bread must be ready for them. He adjusts his shaping, refining his pace. "Tell the steward it will be done." The girl nods quickly and scurries out again, her footsteps fast, almost skipping. The baker watches her leave and allows himself a small exhale. Days with travelers always stretch a bit longer, but they also weave the castle into the wider world. Through stories told beside the hearth, through accents and news, through the exchange of goods and tales. He returns to shaping the dough. His hands glide over the surface, pressing, smoothing, tucking. The bread becomes a reflection of his quiet diligence. Firm, rounded, balanced. Once shaped, he arranges the loaves onto a floured board and sets them near the hearth to rise. The warmth from the oven encourages the dough to expand, each loaf growing slowly like a mound of earth warmed by the sun. He turns his attention back to the oven. The embers have settled lower now, glowing with a soft orange pulse. He adds a few pieces of split oak, the logs catching with gentle pops and crackles. The flame rises again, not fierce but steady, growing taller in slow waves that lean against the stone interior. He uses the long-handled broom of bundled twigs to clear the oven floor once more. Each sweep sends a faint drift of ash curling into the air before it settles again. Ash is part of this world. On the floor, on the hearthstones, on the baker's sleeves. It has settled into the cracks of this kitchen over generations, silent and patient. Once the oven has reached its new balance, he checks the altar loaves cooling by the window. They have firmed beautifully, soft golden tops, edges rounded, no cracks that would disrupt their purity. He arranges them neatly on a small board, ready for the old man's return. While he works, a group of workers pass by the kitchen doorway, carrying tools over their shoulders. Mallets, chisels, ropes, and wooden stakes. They speak in low tones about repairing a section of the outer wall that has weathered badly over the winter. Their boots thud softly on the stone floor as they move past, and a faint draft follows them. The baker glances toward the window again. Outside, the sky is a muted, uneven gray, with the clouds still moving slowly across the valley. He senses rain in the distance. Not yet here, but coming. A damp afternoon would thicken the air, lengthen baking times, perhaps complicate the drying of grain sacks. He takes note of this silently. A baker must always know the weather, even without needing to speak of it. A moment later, the old scribe returns, moving slowly but with purpose. He stops beside the board with the altar loaves and breathes out a quiet sigh of relief. "They look perfect," he whispers. The baker nods, lifting the board and placing it gently into the man's waiting hands. The old scribe steadies himself, adjusting his grip, ensuring the bread is secure before turning away. "I'll see them safely to the chapel," he says softly. His footsteps fade again down the corridor. With that done, the baker finally allows himself to sit for a moment. He lowers himself onto the same wooden stool beside the oven, stretching his back, hands resting palm down on his knees. His knuckles are dusted with flour, his fingertips tinged with a faint gray of ash. These marks are familiar, almost comforting, symbols of a life spent in daily service to others. As he rests, he listens, not to the loud noises of the kitchen, but to the smaller ones. The faint settling crack of cooling loaves. The quiet shuffling of tools as cooks rearrange their stations. The tiny hiss of a drop of water landing near the edge of the hearth. The low hum of a flame licking the underside of the oven arch. These sounds gather together like threads of a tapestry. A tapestry woven every day, from before dawn until late into the afternoon. No one in the castle thinks much about bread. They only know it is always there. But the baker knows each loaf is the result of patient hours, watched heat, and quiet decisions. Even the simplest piece of bread is a small story of earth, fire, and labor. He rises again, checking the dough rising near the hearth. Has grown fuller, almost ready. He lifts one loaf and tests its weight. Slightly airy, filled with the promise of expansion. As he prepares the peel again, a shadow appears in the doorway. A young guard steps inside, wiping rain from his brow, though no rain has yet fallen here. He looks worried. "The travelers have arrived," he says. "More than expected." The baker nods once, placing the loaf down gently. "Then let us be ready." He turns back to the oven, slides the peel beneath the first loaf, and feels the warmth on his cheeks. The fire glows brighter, as though aware that the next round of bread will serve new hands, new voices, new stories carried from the road outside the castle walls. The day grows longer. The bread continues rising. And the castle waits, hungry, expectant, trusting the baker's steady craft. The baker steadies the peel in his hands, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingers. It has grown smooth over the years, polished not by oil or varnish, but by countless loaves sliding across its surface. He lifts the first risen loaf from the board, setting it onto the peel with practiced care. Its weight is good, light enough to promise a soft crumb, yet heavy enough to satisfy the workers who will eat it. He steps toward the oven. The gentle humph of heat meets him, as though the fire breathes out to greet the new dough. He slides the loaf inside. A soft hiss escapes as the dough touches the hot stone. One by one, he adds the other loaves. Each movement is smooth, unhurried, as if guided by something older than memory. When the peel emerges empty, he steps aside to let the fire work its quiet transformation. Behind him, the kitchen grows busier as word spreads of the unexpected travelers. Cooks begin chopping more root vegetables, stirring heavier pots, and bringing out baskets of dried herbs long saved for days when more mouths arrive. The soundscape swells, chopping, splashing, scraping, stirring, yet somehow it remains gentle around the baker's station, as though everyone instinctively lowers their voices near the bread. A potboy rushes by, nearly tripping over a broom. He catches himself, breathless, hair sticking up from a morning of frantic errands. "Master Baker," he says. "They say 2 of the travelers are injured, one with a cut leg, the other." Well, he looks faint. "They came from the North Road." The baker nods slowly, considering the news. Injured travelers often carried stories with them. Stories of bandits, storms, sudden dangers on the road. But they also carried hunger. And hunger was a simpler thing to tend. "There will be warm bread ready," the baker murmurs. The boy nods gratefully and dashes away again, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The baker returns to his stool beside the oven, leaning forward slightly as he listens. Bread speaks in subtle cues. Tiny cracks, faint puffs, the shifting tone of the oven's heat. Already he can hear the beginnings of crust forming, a delicate ticking sound like cooling pottery. He closes his eyes briefly, allowing the warmth to settle deeper into his bones. Morning has stretched long, and the afternoon will demand even more. Yet there is a calm that comes with the work, a quiet order that settles the mind. Each loaf follows the next. Each movement flows into another. The world outside may shift, bruise, or bewilder, but the bread stays steady. After several minutes, he opens the oven again. The heat rolls out like a soft wave, brushing his cheeks and arms. He taps one of the loaves lightly with the back of his finger. The crust responds with a hollow, resonant sound. Not yet finished, but close. He watches how the tops have cracked in rustic lines, the way the flour dusting has baked into small pale freckles. The smell lifts, deep, grainy, warm. It fills the kitchen, drifts into the hallway, and begins to mingle with the scents of stew and herbs. Several cooks glance over, smiling unconsciously. The aroma of baking bread has a way of quieting even the busiest minds. Just then the helper girl returns. Her cheeks are flushed, her wool sleeves pushed high above her elbows. She approaches the baker with a mixture of excitement and worry. "Master," she says softly, "the steward asks, should we stretch the flour? There may not be enough if more travelers arrive by dusk." The baker stands still for a moment. Stretching flour meant adding more water, perhaps more barley or rye, creating loaves that would be denser and less soft. It was common in years of poor harvest, but this season's grain had been kind so far. Still, he knows that travelers rarely arrive alone. One group often signals another not far behind. He kneels slightly to look the girl in the eyes. "Fetch the grain sack we received this morning," he says gently. "We will see how much remains. For now, we bake as we always do." The girl nods with visible relief, then hurries away. The baker turns back to the oven and breathes deeply. The air is warmer now, thick with the weight of the fire and the steady presence of the bread. He pulls the peel from its hook, preparing to remove the first finished loaf. He opens the oven door again. The loaves have turned a deeper gold, crusts cracked beautifully. He slides the peel beneath the first round, lifts easily. He removes it from the oven, placing it on the table, where cool air begins to kiss the hot crust. Steam rises, soft and white, disappearing as quickly as it forms. The second loaf follows, then the third. The peel moves like an extension of his own arm. No hesitation, no fumbling. As he works, he hears quiet voices near the doorway. Two travelers stand there, dirt-streaked, cloaked in dust from the northern road. One leans heavily on a makeshift walking stick. The other wraps a cloth tightly around his forearm. Their faces are tired, hollow with exhaustion, yet softened with gratitude as they breathe in the scent of fresh bread. A guard escorts them past the kitchen toward the infirmary, but the injured one pauses long enough to murmur, "That smell, we haven't known it for days." The baker doesn't speak. He simply inclines his head gently, offering a silent reassurance that warmth and food are here now. After the travelers disappear down the corridor, the helper girl returns dragging the sack of grain. She sets it down with effort, wiping her brow. The baker unties the top and peers inside. The grain is plentiful, golden, clean, more than enough to carry the castle through several days even with extra guests. Relief moves through him like a slow breath. "No stretching today," he says softly. The girl beams, almost bouncing on her feet. She loves the days when the bread can be made in full strength. Together, they scoop grain into a wooden bowl, preparing the next mixture. The girl mirrors his movements, her small hands mimicking the angle at which he pours, the careful way he levels the flour, the quiet way he mixes water in a slow spiral. Her focus is intense, but there is a soft joy in her eyes. The baker says nothing, yet his small nod of approval brings a shy smile to her face. Outside, thunder rumbles faintly, just once, distant, low, like a warning whispered across the valley. The baker turns to the window. The sky has darkened a shade. Clouds gather in slower, heavier folds. Rain is coming. He can feel it in the air, the way the warmth thickens, the way the wind dips before drawing breath again. Rain would drive more travelers toward the castle. It would make the roads dangerous and turn the fields to mud. It would keep the fires burning longer. Bread. Bread would need to be made deep into the evening. He places his hands on the table, grounding himself in the steady touch of flour and wood. The next batch must begin soon. The fire must be tended. And the castle waits, quietly, trustingly, unknowingly, for the bread that will carry it through whatever storm approaches. The baker brushes loose flour from his palms, the gentle dust rising like a pale mist before settling on the worn wooden table. Outside, the sky thickens with clouds the way dough thickens with time. Slowly, silently, almost imperceptibly until it becomes undeniable. A faint breeze pushes against the shutters, making them tremble with a muted clatter. He listens for a moment. Every sound in the kitchen has shifted, just slightly. The cooks speak in quieter tones, the clinking of ladles slows, even the crackle of the hearth seems to brace itself. Weather carries a mood, and today the mood is one that asks for steadiness, warmth, reassurance. He draws the bowl of grain closer. The helper girl stands beside him, waiting for instruction like a candle waiting for a spark. He gestures gently. "We'll grind more," he murmurs. Together, they pour the grains into the small hand mill. The sound begins softly, a gritty, circling hush as the stones turn. It is a soothing rhythm, one that repeats and deepens, like a heartbeat wrapped in burlap. The girl pushes the handle carefully, her small arm moving with determination even as the mill resists. The baker steadies the mill with one hand. He knows this part can feel endless for a child, grain becoming flour one breath at a time, but patience is a breadmaker's first instrument, and she is learning. "It feels slower today," she whispers. He nods. "Rain in the air," he says softly. "It makes the mill feel heavier." Her eyes widen as though this is a secret knowledge passed down through centuries of bakers. In truth, it is simply a quiet observation, but quiet observations are the bones of old trades. As they grind, the kitchen door creaks open. The steward enters, tall, stern, but with a weariness that sits around his shoulders like a cloak. He approaches the baker with steps soft enough to respect the space but firm enough to carry urgency. "I've spoken with the guard," the steward says. "The travelers came from a caravan. More are behind them. Possibly many more." The baker breathes slowly through his nose. More travelers meant more bread, more strain on the larder, more work through the night. But he does not flinch. This kitchen has weathered such days before, and bread is forgiving so long as the hands remain steady. "When will they arrive?" he asks. "Before nightfall," the steward replies. "If the storm doesn't slow them." The baker glances again at the window. The first droplets tap lightly against the shutters, soft, uncertain, as though testing the wood. Rain always begins as a whisper before it finds its voice. The steward steps closer. "We'll need bread for the hall, and for the infirmary," he adds quietly. "Perhaps double." The baker nods without hesitation. "We will manage." The steward exhales, visibly relieved, and takes his leave. He trusts the baker. Everyone in the castle does. Bread may seem simple, but in old strongholds, bread was life. Warm bread kept spirits from breaking, kept bellies full, kept order steady. Bread was more than food. It was a promise. When the steward exits, the helper girl looks up, worry in her expression. "Master, will there be enough?" "There will be," he answers gently. "Because we will make it so." A calm settles over her, and she resumes the grinding with new resolve. As flour gathers in the bowl beneath the mill, the baker begins setting out the tools for mixing. He lines them in the same order every time. The wooden spoon with a curved handle, the ceramic pitcher of water, the cracked bowl that has survived more years than anyone can count. His hands move with familiarity, each touch awakening memories of earlier mornings, earlier loaves, earlier storms. He pours the fresh flour into the wide mixing bowl, the fine powder settling like drifting snow. The girl pauses her grinding to watch, her eyes following every slow gesture. "Water," he murmurs. She brings the pitcher with both hands. It is heavy for her, and she moves carefully, as though carrying something sacred. He steadies it as she tilts it forward, letting the water stream into the flour. The sound is subtle, a quiet trickle, almost like the first thin pouring of rain outside. He begins mixing with his hand, fingers curling through the cool flour and warm water. The dough forms slowly, finding shape under his patient movements. There is something soothing in watching loose grains transform into a living mass, something that always quiets the mind. As the dough thickens, the girl places her hands beside his in silent request to help. He nods, guiding her small palms into the mixture. She laughs softly at the stickiness, at the way the dough tugs at her fingers. It is a pure sound, a sound that cuts through the tension creeping into the castle. "Knead," he says gently. Together they push the dough forward, fold it back, press again. The rhythm is old, older than the castle, older than the valley, older than their ancestors who first learned how grain and water could feed an entire village. The motion is steady, grounding, dependable. Inside, the rain deepens. It patters more firmly against the stone walls, its voice gathering strength. Wind pushes the shutters harder. The world beyond the kitchen begins to blur under the growing gray. One of the cooks passes by, whispering. The guard spotted more figures on the ridge. Another murmurs. The storm is chasing them. The baker does not stop kneading. Storms come and go. People flee and find shelter. Bread remains. He turns the dough, pushing his weight into it. The girl mirrors him. Their hands move in unison, like two musicians following the same slow melody. When the dough finally reaches the perfect smoothness, soft but firm, elastic but calm, he lifts it gently and sets it near the hearth to rise. The warmth there is steady, unchanging, a reliable cradle for new loaves. The rain outside intensifies, drumming a steady rhythm against the fortress walls. In the hallway, hurried footsteps pass again and again. Voices grow more urgent. Yet the kitchen remains a pocket of warmth, a cocoon of firelight and flour, protected by the quiet work at its center. The baker moves toward the oven, checking the embers. He adds another log, oak, thick and slow burning. Flames leap up, then settle into a deep orange glow. The crackling feels like an old song returning. Soon, the risen dough will become more rounds, more loaves for weary travelers. But as he closes the oven door, a sound cuts through the rain. Not thunder, not footsteps, something else. A distant horn. Long, low, warning. It echoes across the valley, vibrating through stone and wood. The baker freezes mid-step. The helper girl looks at him, eyes wide, flour still clinging to her wrists. Master, what does that mean? He doesn't answer. Not yet. Because even he doesn't know. Not fully. Not yet. The horn fades into the rolling thunder, leaving the kitchen in a stillness so deep that even the fire seems to quiet itself. The baker stands with one hand resting on the wooden table, listening, not with his ears alone, but with that deeper instinct sharpened by years of early dawns and silent hallways. The helper girl edges closer, her small fingers brushing the sleeve of his tunic. Master, is the horn for danger? She whispers. He kneels beside her, placing a steady hand lightly on her shoulder. Not always, he murmurs, voice calm, low, almost like a lullaby. Sometimes it means travelers are nearer than we thought. Sometimes it means the watch saw something in the storm. She swallows, but his tone softens the fear gathering in her eyes. The baker knows the truth is uncertain, but panic would do no good. Not in a kitchen that needs steady hands more than ever. He stands again and walks to the window, pushing it open just enough for air. Cool, rain-scented, carrying distant echoes of hooves or perhaps only the restless wind. The valley below is veiled in gray mist. Raindrops streak down the stone, shimmering as they catch the fire's light behind him. Shapes move along the outer road. Small at first, flickers of motion too blurred by distance to decipher. He narrows his eyes. Travelers, perhaps, or something else. But the horn had sounded only once, long and low, which often meant caution, not calamity. That, at least, brings a thin thread of reassurance. He closes the shutter gently and returns to the hearth. The dough near the fire has risen beautifully, round, plump, swelling with quiet promise. He presses a hand into it slowly, feeling the soft resistance, the way it springs back beneath his fingers. Ready. As he divides the dough into smaller pieces, the kitchen lights begin to shift, candles glowing in deeper golds as the storm darkens the day outside. Shadows lengthen over the brick floor, stretching like long, gentle brushstrokes. The cooks continue their work with hushed purpose. A pot ladles thick stew into clay bowls. Another grinds dried herbs between his palms, the aroma drifting warmly into the flour-dusted air. Every scent layers atop another. Bread rising, onions simmering, rain seeping through the window frames. All of it blends into a soft, warm tapestry that feels older than the castle itself. The helper girl brings the wooden board to the baker, placing it beside him with quiet pride. "You'll need this for shaping," she says. He smiles softly at her growing confidence. Together they form the dough into smooth rounds. One for the hall, one for the infirmary, one for the weary, one for the hungry, one for whatever unknown faces hide inside the traveling group inching closer through the storm. Each loaf carries weight, not just in grain but in hope. When the rounds are finished, he scores the tops with gentle strokes of a small blade. Nothing extravagant, just simple lines, the kind used for centuries to guide heat through the crust. Patterns that look almost like small pathways if one imagines them carefully. Lightning flashes briefly outside, painting the kitchen with white light. Thunder follows with a slow rumble. The baker draws in a long breath, then opens the oven again. The fire glows steady, unwavering, ready. He slides each loaf inside. The peel glides in smooth arcs, the dough slipping onto the hot stone with soft, quiet hisses. When the last loaf is placed, he closes the oven door and leans both hands on its warm surface. For a few slow breaths, he stays there, motionless, grounded by the hum of the fire and the distant patter of rain. Behind him, the helper girl begins cleaning the table, wiping flour into small soft clouds. Even the simple sweeping motion seems slower now, calmer, as if the kitchen itself has settled into a waiting silence. The horn does not sound again, only rain, and thunder, and the faint murmurs of guards preparing for whoever approaches. Minutes pass. The dough inside begins to rise again, crust forming under the relentless heat. The scent grows stronger, drifting through the kitchen in waves so comforting that even passing servants pause, shoulders relaxing slightly. Footsteps, not hurried but firm. Approaching. The baker turns. The guard captain enters the kitchen doorway. Rainwater drips from his cloak, pattering onto the stone. His expression is serious, but not panicked. Steady, like someone choosing every word carefully before speaking it aloud. "More travelers are coming," he says. "A great many. Some wounded. Some carrying bundles too heavy for the road." Pauses. "And they say they were followed." The room stills. Followed. Not simply traveling. Not simply seeking shelter from a storm. Something moves beneath those words. Something shadowed, uncertain, not yet visible. The baker feels the weight of the moment settle over him like a cloak. He does not ask questions. He does not speculate. He simply nods. "We will have bread," he says softly. The captain bows his head in gratitude before turning away. Footsteps echoing down the corridor. The baker returns to the oven, listening to the faint popping of crust forming inside, the quiet voice of bread speaking through heat and time. A smell deep and soothing fills the room. Even with uncertainty pressing in from outside, the kitchen remains a sanctuary of warmth and purpose. He pulls out the first loaf. Golden, cracked beautifully, alive with steam. He places it onto the board. Another follows, and another. By the time the last loaf emerges, the storm outside echoes louder, wind battering the shutters like impatient hands. The baker arranges the loaves gently, their warmth brushing against his palms. He feels the weight of what lies beyond the castle walls, and yet in this moment, the bread feels like a shield, fragile, humble, but deeply human. He looks at the doorway where the guard had stood moments before. More travelers, followed, possibly chased, and night approaching. The baker closes his eyes for a moment. The storm, the horn, the unknown on the ridge. Something is coming, but the bread is ready, and as long as the fire burns, there will be warmth here, at least for a little while longer. Even if the footsteps in the distance now sound closer than before. And now, as the storm gathers its voice and the travelers inch closer to the safety of the castle walls, take a slow breath in, and an even slower breath out. Let the gentle scent of the warm bread settle in your imagination. The quiet crackle of the fire. The patter of soft rain against old stone. Close your eyes if you wish. Let your mind rest in the warm glow of the hearth, just for a moment, before the next chapter begins. There, somewhere beyond the mist,